So, hello everyone. Are we all inside? Everyone who wants to be at the panel debate. I guess maybe you don't need this mic.
I would like to present you. I'm very slow these days, but we are now gathering in the hypothalamus, and the brain have inputs from right and left, as organs normally have. And I'm looking forward till som enzym and what processes we have been through. She will be the leading impulse. Welcome.
Thank you.
And welcome to everyone here for our panel debate with guests from Copenhagen and Baltimore in the USA, and two people live here, and the Homeostatic Orchestra, as you can see behind me. So I want to present to you the people that are participating in this panel debate. I will be representing Podinense Collective. My name is Jenny Graff, and we have over here Ida Benk, who comes from Laboratory for Aesthetics and Ecology, who is part of a collective research group on that front, and I'll let her say something about herself in a moment. And we have Per Sørup from Harbølle Mejeri, representing from a local mejeri here. We have, like I said, the Homeostatic Mycelium Homeostatic Orchestra, led by Ture Larsen. And we also have Stephanie Barber live on screen with the palm trees waving in Baltimore, the tropical land of Baltimore, Maryland, USA, 7:30 a.m. in the morning. Welcome, Stephanie. We have, glad to hear you finally coming through. Adam Benkert from Medicinsk Museum and Center for Basic Metabolic Research at Copenhagen University, or through Copenhagen University. And so I just want to give one sort of quick word to each person, each participant, to just say briefly what your focus is, so the people in the audience here can get a sense for what you bring to this panel debate on metabolism. So we've had this theme, Stofskifte en kunstnerisk manifestation, which is an artistic manifestation of the ideas of metabolism, both cultural metabolism, artistic metabolism, scientific metabolism, and what metabolism can teach us about our connections and borders and perforations between things we call things, and things we call humans, and things we call plants and minerals. So I think we'll learn a little bit about that from some of you. And I think I'm just going to hand it over to the participants. Maybe we'll start with the ones online. Stephanie, let's start with you. Stephanie is an artist, and she's a poet, and she's also written this beautiful collage poem book called The Sympathetic Metabolism of an Island. And it's right here.
You can find it in the bar?
Yeah. You can find it in the bar. It's beautiful, risograph print. So I wanted her to introduce herself in whatever way she can. She's a very diverse artist, but we'll start with you, Stephanie.
Okay, hi everybody. Can I make a request first? Is there any way that the other camera can be turned on so I can see you all there? I would love that, please, if it's possible. Yeah, I am an artist. I work with a lot of different media, mostly around language. And the piece that I created for you all for this project is roughly trying to contemplate the idea of a metabolism for an island as a metaphor for a lot of looking at it through a lot of different lenses. One thing that I didn't touch on in those poetic fragments is quarantine, but I've been writing those little pieces and doing the cutouts all summer and feeling as if I am on a particular kind of island in this quarantine. So it's a sort of nice rhyme. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm going to hand it over to you, Adam.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Adam. I'm associate professor at the Medical Museum, which is the University of Copenhagen's Museum for the Culture and History of Medicine. And then I'm also affiliated with the Novo Nordisk Foundation's Center for Basic Metabolic Research. While that sounds very sciencey, I am not a molecular biologist. I am a humanist. I have a background in philosophy and history. But I've been associated with this metabolic center for over almost 10 years now, and have really, from that association and from the contact with the metabolic sciences and increasing doing exhibitions on the history and culture of metabolic science, really trying to actually think seriously with metabolism, not just as an object of study, but also as something that can provide us with methodologies, with particular gaze on the world. And me and other colleagues at the Museum are developing what we call metabolic humanities, so a kind of humanistic
aside when you're 65. And I decided to do something totally, absolutely different and set up a small cheese-making factory here in Hårbølle, actually a kilometer from here. And that factory is not a factory, it's me making cheese and yogurt handmade. I've done that now for 8, 9, 10 years. And we have just started milking sheeps to do our own sheep milk to get closer and closer to what is the concept behind my cheese making, namely to make high quality products on local raw materials, and try to explain to everybody that high quality in food doesn't come just out of the blue. It comes from soil, mud, rain, snow, dirty around here. I'm happy that you have seen rain. It would have been too bad if you had only 2 days of sunshine. So I decided to take a bottle of mud with me. That's how I normally describe this. So a bottle of mud, a bottle of grass, some sheep milk, some yogurt, some of my own shit, some earth and mud, because that illustrates, as you understand, the metabolic circle. That is what I like to illustrate to people. I sell my products to places like Noma. For those of you, well, Noma is known over the world, one of the world's famous restaurants. We sell our sheep milk yogurt there. And I sometimes wonder whether these famous people eating that yogurt understand what I just explained to you now. I've proposed to Noma and some of the other very beautiful restaurants that I should come with my 5 bottles of mud, shit, grass. So that's what I'm doing now. And when I got the invitation to come here and the invitation to join former workshops in this area, as you can see, I have to say yes, because it's exactly in the middle of what I'm interested in.
Wonderful. So I have some questions here that were formulated by the collective, the Pudnense Collective. And at one point, we will also open it up to the audience to participate in question asking. But I will first start with a question, and I would like you to raise your hand, indicate if you have an interest in answering or responding. Some of them are statements, some of them are prompts, and some of them are questions. So the first one is, are there different temporal aspects to metabolism, such as time, speed, circadian rhythms, pauses? Is there anyone who has any thoughts on that? Per?
I have on all also.
Okay, well, give us just a bit so we have time.
Yes, of course, there is. I mean, everybody knows by her or himself that your way of eating, your way of digesting things depends on whether you are awake, sick, awake, whether it's spring, summer, winter. So yes, of course, yes to all questions, all of the questions.
Mm.
Is there anyone who would like to elaborate on that? Adam, you had something?
Well, I can. One of the really interesting. I'm working on an exhibition project at the moment, which is called "The World Is in You," and we try to combine microbiome research with circadian biology and epigenetics and astrobiology. And one of the really interesting things that has come out of that reflection, and a lot of that, of course, is involved directly in metabolism, is how time and its effect on metabolism is being studied at the moment in molecular biology. Because what has happened is people have found out that actually there are circadian clocks even in individual cells. So down to the cellular level of our bodies, there are things that respond to planetary movements and that are trained to our temporal niche. And this is a huge problem in molecular biology because suddenly time becomes a factor, even if you're working with cell lines that have been cultured and aren't connected to any body, so to speak.
And I think that this also relates to a project like this, like the temporality of art practices, because the whole setup usually around how we do art productions, how we do exhibitions has a really sort of hectic and problematic temporality in the sense that we're always, producing, and we're also probably all of us overproducing a lot of the time. So I think that the idea of doing art projects or aesthetic projects that have longer temporality, work with longer stretches, work with cyclic time, or even like a lifetime or beyond, I think that is something that is very interesting. So I just wanted to put that in there, even though I know that is derailing the conversation a little bit.
No, please derail. Derail.
I feel like that's not at all derailing. I keep bees, and the other day I was, like working the bees and getting some honey, and it's a really obvious thought. I'm sorry, can you tell me your name again, Kyria? Ada.
Yeah,
Ada. Yeah, and while you were speaking about that, thinking about putting a show together and the hectic, pace of at different times, maybe in a lot of ways, humans, our honey, our collective process of culture is really on a long scale. Like the work that I am doing right now and you are doing and we all are engaged in is about something that was begun 700 years ago, like where we are now collectively.
Absolutely. The problem is, though, that there's very little institutional there are very few institutional platforms that are able to carry this kind of work through, right? I mean, this is at least a problem that I see. It's a sort of practical problem that we're not used to dealing with these kinds of processes within the art world. And so I really welcome these kinds of projects that take different temporalities, work with the garden, work with longer stretches of time. I think that's very interesting.
And just from, as a member of the Pudnensa Collective, I just wanted to say, like, that's, I think, some of the things we were hoping to achieve is to try to break down that tendency to do things now, do things for the audience, make things finished, but to invite people into a process and have artists be able to come back and be able to continue to work on things. So we have a couple pieces that probably will take or many years. We have the Forest Garden, which you don't see much right now, but we call it the Forest Garden because we planted trees there last year, and we can see little trees coming up in the Forest Garden. You can go say hello to them. And then Baltz did a performance where he buried a piece of glass with some text on it, and Fritz buried some film that's going to be processed by the earth, and there's some metabolic fungi processes going on in the new water filtration system, and so on and so on. And the totem, and there's a totem, mushroom totem, that's going to be sprouting lion's mane in probably 1 year. Okay, I'm like have to remember all the things that are time-based, but it's all of it. Yeah, then we also have this Weave project, which you'll probably see on the screen in between things today, and definitely you'll see it online.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
can I just add to
Yes,
this?
please
I think,
add.
I think Ida's point is very, very important. Actually, you're talking about it in arts. But I think the whole, as you can understand from our headmaster here, is true for life.
Absolutely.
One of my sons-in-law is a history professor, and I always wonder how the historians are able, so to speak, to freeze history, to make it different from what you're talking about, namely to see history as a kind of living organism. I just wanted to add to that very briefly that now that we are in Hårbølle, we should know that there are many artists that have been working on exactly putting the time dimension into their art pieces. I mean, we have the famous Bjørn Nørgaard having an art gallery just close to here, and he has for many years in the Fluxus movement that he has been working with been interested in degradation. You know, this famous German artist that put raw meat into one of the big famous museums in, I think it was New York, but I forgot actually which one, just to show people the degradation of raw meat, by whatever that means. Unfortunately, they couldn't smell it. I think that's really a mistake because you need to smell it at the same time. But this Bjørn Nørgaard put up 3 years ago a wall made by earth and stone, the old way to put up walls, and grass, you know, putting it together. And the whole point is there to show the degradation of that wall through time. I think that's interesting. It's a kind of artistic metabolism. No?
Yeah, thank you for bringing in the lineage that we're coming after and reacting to, because I know that those are some of the artists that I've been influenced by, the movements, Fluxus, and some of the surrounding artist movements. So I think that's great that you mentioned that. So I'm going to move on to another question, and that is, how do we, no, I'm going to ask this one. Is metabolism democratic?
I'd say it's universal, but it's not democratic at all.
I really agree with what Adam has just said, but also I was thinking that sometimes people use we are given, what our sort of, you know, evolution thus far has been and what our environment is.
Interesting.
Access.
Ida, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I agree, and this is just adding to what you have been saying, Adam and Stephanie, is that I think sometimes a problem within this whole conversation that we're having is that we forget to situate these questions, and we forget to talk about particular vulnerabilities that have to do with social inequality, that have to do with access to clean water, clean air, etc., etc. So just like qualifying and situating those conversations that we're having around these multi-species or interspecies entanglements that are, you know, wonderful to think with and to work with, but also sometimes become, I think in my opinion, and I would be interested in hearing your opinion, a little too abstract maybe sometimes, difficult to really work with in terms of political engagement, in terms of political action. So I think that's at least a problem that I have been, or that we in our collective are struggling with, the question of how to take these wonderful ideas of becoming with each other in these sort of planetary communities, which are, you know, as I said, wonderful to think with, but also sometimes I think a little bit too big of a story to really, you know, engage with in ways that are politically meaningful also. That is not to say that it's impossible, but it's just sometimes need a little bit of adjustment, I feel. And then I would maybe also add that the whole notion of democracy, and I think, Stephanie, that's also what you're saying, is also needs qualification or situating what heritage, sort of what discourse are we talking? Are we sort of directing ourselves into when we speak democracy? It's a very human concept, of course, but it's also a very particular human concept. From a particular culture that we inhabit. So I think that all of this needs a little bit of like self-critical, situating ourselves within that story, because democracy certainly is a very difficult and problematic word to begin with. Yeah.
So now I wanted to open it up to the rest of you to make a comment or ask a question, or I don't know what other options there are. Requests. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts? Plus, I just also wanted to say I'm sharing a microphone with you, and it is Corona time, so if you don't feel comfortable with that, you can also not use the microphone, and you can just stand up and speak loudly.
As an enzyme, I have to say that nature by itself are in balance, but as humans bring different ways from the capitalism, for example, make it not in balance.
Is there anyone who would like to respond to that? Yes?
Yeah, Well, I don't know if I can properly, but I love the idea. I'm thinking a lot about balance and what that means, and I think that maybe this is sort of self-evident, but thinking about like the lineage of evolutionary psychology, um, which also goes like to epigenetics, or like our responses to something, our fight or flight, our stress levels. That what balance looks like is not necessarily this even, I'm going to say horizon just because of my background. That balance also is temporal, so that something might be out of balance for, several generations and then come back into balance. We're constantly understanding our existence as on our human sense of a time scale, which is really different than a beetle's time scale or a mountain's time. And we want balance within this one space, and maybe that's not really attainable.
Yeah, I think if I can add to that, I think the balance is an incredibly central concept in all of this, having to do with metabolism, and there's a whole philosophy of balance to be. It's probably been written already in some points, but I think there's a kind of material philosophy of balance or a metabolic philosophy of balance that deserves development, in which the nuances of a system that is at once both stable and entropic needs sort of to be fleshed out, because you find balance at moments, but of course everything requires eating everything else in order to sustain itself. So there is never a kind of neutral balance. There is never a balance that is kind of perfect in its equilibrium, right? It's always coming out of order. There's always sort of disorder as the structure of the universe, essentially. So how do you maintain balances within it? And what is a good balance? What does that, if you step away from idealized versions of balance into a more concrete, materialized sense of what that means, then what would that look like? Maybe that's a task for us, and maybe that's an artistic task as well.
Well, I'd like to know, personally, I'd like to know what the clarinet thinks about that. Ida, did you have some?
I just
Comments
had
on
a
that?
question that I would like to ask all of us. How can we have balance, or can we have balance in a deeply unequal society? I think that is something that I would like to know or explore a little further.
Let's hear from the trumpet and trombone about balance. Per?
I think balance is central, but we need to understand that any political system is there exactly to set up the rules for the balances we want to achieve.
I guess, Ada, maybe I'm going to be redundant to what I was just thinking about. I just think that the myth of balance is such a human concept, it's such a human and unattainable myth. It depends on perspective, what one looks, what the whale thinks is a nice balance between their, their buoyancy and the ocean, and what, every organism looking towards another organism has a different sense of balance. into the anthropocentrism of thinking that balance is only about a fairness within a political system, like can't account for what is happening, I think. Which sounds cynical, but maybe it's what we're all trying to do is maybe define the question a little more clearly. Are you hoping for a human balance in a political system right now in this time in the Western world?
We have another question from the audience over here.
I'm the bartender. I'm the bartender of the moment. I serve you. I think there's a card that always plays in these kind of gatherings, circles around the world, which is the card of death. I think it's a very fundamental card. Yeah, and I think it's the key. I think it's the key to every situation we are in, is that we forget about death. We just forget that we are going to die. And that triggers us, because we don't like the idea of our departure. So when we evolve as a human species to understand that the infinity of evolution and the more spiritual nature of our being, we will be more able to live on this planet and to be at peace, fundamentally. Yeah. So thank you. Remember death.
Per?
I think that's exactly why it's so good that we are here in a group of artists, because that is exactly so difficult to understand without the help of artists. That you need people, as I said before, demonstrating what is death. Death is decaying things. It's worms eating you. It's bad smell. It's the end of everything for you personally, but not for the world. I think you artists should maybe concentrate on that, illustrate that, time after time.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Any comments?
And it can also be nicer. You can.
Is that your shit? You're gonna pass around with a spoon?
You can also illustrate something nicer. Metabolism is also eating my yogurt, explaining sheep, grass, milk, yogurt. You don't need to go much further.
Oh, I thought you were gonna let me eat it.
You know, the taste continues. That's what you learn from these big restaurants here. Du må gerne spise det.
like to know, does anyone have any thoughts on how do we metabolize language? I mean, you were talking about death, and I think a lot about language and the evolution of languages and the death of languages and the change of languages and the mourning of lost languages. Do we have any thoughts on how language is metabolized or how language metabolizes? Some spoons for anyone who wants to try the yogurt. Here, you take this. You're the distributor.
Yeah. I love that question, Jenny, or that thought. And like Wittgenstein, I'm super interested in the endless lability of language. I think language is constantly metabolizing and changing and dying, and I think that that is okay. I don't mourn lost languages. I loved the debates that were raging when texts first came about, how text writing and spelling and shorthand and language was changing everybody's understanding of at least the English language. And then other linguists were so thrilled by the sort of verifiable lineage of that change because of the way that text is necessarily documented. We can actually see that history, that brief history. I just think it's a beautiful way to think about it, Jenny, that all of our cultural offerings, human cultural offerings, are endlessly changing.
Ida.
I think maybe Pierre was first.
Well, I was about to say that language has to metabolize. Language is changing always and should. What we might see here is some very dramatic changes due to technological developments. I mean, we are in a technology really hot zone. And here, if you talked with the technicians, you would hear all kinds of strange languages coming up.
Can I just add something? Because I think what's also really interesting, and that's just thinking with your question, Jenny, and taking it a little further maybe, how does language also metabolize the world, right? Like, what are the material impacts of how we speak and the words we use and what they mean? So I'm personally deeply in love with these like very queer and radical scientific experiments with how we speak about things. That the very languages we employ have like real physical consequence, right? So I think that this is a wonderful and really important point also, that it matters how we speak. It matters how we sit here right now and we have this wonderful experiment, just like this crazy panel. And we're trying also to reconcile scientific language and aesthetic practices and music and sound. And I think as chaotic as it is, it's really interesting because it actually matters how we speak about the world.
It actually matters.
It matters how we speak about the world.
Matters.
There's a great book by an archaeologist named Denise.
Very, very
Messeret.
good taste, huh? Mm. Mm.
I want to hear more about the book.
Yeah, let's hear about the book.
Okay, thanks. It's pretty interesting. I just wasn't sure. It's called How Really Dense. Oh my goodness, my cat is like in a very unexpected place. I'll take a picture. It's about. Hold on. She's an archaeologist, and she's talking about the ways that language influenced the construction of images. And she bases a larger theory off of the earliest, what she considers to be the earliest artifact created, an illustration after the invention of language. And so what happens is that, or her thesis is that, our understanding and belief in cause and effect comes from the linearity of language and the way that language, we have to go through something to understand the entirety of what is being proposed, say, as opposed to an image, which is always simultaneous and static. So that she has this bowl, this urn, that has an image of an antelope running, and you turn the bowl and there's a hunter pursuing the antelope. And all images from that time on move from graphic or singular representations to a narrative space. And then consequently our comprehension of how we exist and what cause and effect is influenced by the way that the technology, the new technology of language unfurls. I don't know if I really said that. It's hard to hold on yet. Back me up, Adam.
Maybe I'll make a different point, but I think it's one of the things which I like about metabolism and thinking with metabolism is that it also allows us to displace language slightly. There is often a kind of over-reliance on linguistic interpretation as the foundational characteristic of what it means to be human. But if there is any universal lexicon, it is metabolism, right? It takes priority over all of those things. That's the universal language, right? That's not the things that come out of our mouth, or the thing that happens in the brain, apart from the metabolic processes that happens in the brain. There's a sense in which paying attention to metabolism allows us to also displace some of that, human-centeredness that comes out of a kind of when language becomes too dominant in our interpretive models of the world. Right? I think there is a really rich value in just looking at stuff getting broken down and rearranged and absorbed and changed, because that's what pushes the world around. And then language comes, at least for my money, language comes as a secondary effect off of that. Of course, intertwined within it, but without metabolism and without that underlying biological lexicon that is, then none of all of that other stuff would happen. And we often tend to not be able to perceive the nuanced effects of metabolism because we're so close to it. But, as anyone who has tried to write a poem while being hungry, there is a sense in which the metabolic processes morph everything around and tone and shape what happens linguistically also.
Can I just ask Adam a question? Because I agree and I understand where he's coming from. Adam, I want to ask you, does it make sense to speak of a metabolic language? Like, do you think that metaphor is fruitful, generative, or would you rather just take the conversation somewhere else entirely?
Well, I think I'd rather use kind of more material metaphors for the exchange that's going on. So the problem with calling it a language is that it makes it seem like it has thoughts and ideas, and agency in some ways, in that intentionality-based way. But I think it's more interesting to look for the kind of material reshuffling metaphors and try to see where those come from. So instead of calling it a language, we could call it, well, essentially simply metabolism, right? That in itself is a different metaphor to work with than linguistic ones, because it is literally about the material breakdown and remaking of language, which is an inherently physical process. And I think that's just it's not that linguistic interpretations aren't important, and it's not that language isn't important. It's just that we're much better at looking at language, and I think neurocognitive gravity pulls us towards language all the time. So we often tend to it's more difficult to tease out these material underpinnings of things. They require a kind of sustained attention. That requires practice and a sensibility, which is also, developing metabolic poetics or developing metabolic humanities or developing metabolic art, for my money, is a way to try to train that sensibility towards the material breakdown and remaking of the world that happens all the time, everywhere. And I think it's just a different way to open up conversations about politics and, all kinds of things.
Thank you all for joining us today for the panel debate. Thank you, Stephanie, for waking up at the crack of dawn with your palm tree. Thank you to Adam for streaming in. Thank you to Per, Ida, and all the Mycelium Homeostatic Orchestra members led by Tua Larsen. And thank you to the audience for being here. We will have about a half an hour to 45-minute break where you can get some drinks over at the bar and look around, and then we will end with our closing ceremony. So let's say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Until
Bye-bye.
next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, Stephanie. Bye, Adam. Bye, everyone watching. Bye. See you soon. Be well.